Okay, hi Stephanie. So I watched the video of your class, and it was for the class was a grade 3, 4, or 5. I'm not sure which one, but anyway, it was a primary school, and it looked like a pretty good class. But there's a number of things I think that in my observation, I thought that you could learn from, and if you did these things better in your classroom, it would make the class, I think, run a lot smoother, and also you would probably get more participation from your students. I found that my main observation was that I found that um, the biggest thing was I saw that a few students were making a lot of comments or talking a lot and answering the questions, just a small number of students, maybe one or two. And then the other students were much quieter. And I found also that that was one of the main points. Another one was, I would say the three things I would like to focus on are norms involving putting into place some norms that will allow you to control the class and how it answers your questions. Students need to raise their hands before they speak. That's number one. Number two was setting a certain level of expectations. And this more has to do with your expectations for the students when in the class was on reading different books that they're interested in. And it seemed to me that some of the students didn't understand some of the books they tried to read, and that's why they didn't complete their reading assignment for the week. And you said that was because they didn't understand the books. Wasn't sure that it was completely clear that they weren't understanding the material, because it seemed like you assumed it. So for that, I would try and get your expectations for them a little bit higher, because it seemed like you had low expectations for them. And also in your instruction, it seemed like it was a bit casual, a bit conversational. And if it's okay to be somewhat casual, but it doesn't need to be too like you're having a conversation with students like they're your friends, because you are actually their teacher, and that relationship needs to be maintained. And that has a lot to do with how your demeanor is in just talking to them. It shouldn't be a casual sort of conversational tone to the way that you're speaking to them. And the third one, main focus was on transitions. I felt that at some point during the class, you weren't sure where to go next. It seemed like there was one point where you said, we're gonna read this, or I'm gonna have you guys read this blurb. It was the blurb, like the back of the book, the summary of it. And you said, I'm going to have you read that. And then you said, yes, okay. And I said, okay. And then you said, well, no, actually, no, I'm going to read this one. So it sounded like you backtracked a little bit with that. So if you had clearer transitions as to like what's going to happen now at this point and this point between the different activities, it would be a more structured way to have the lesson. And so those are the three things: norms for raising your hand, the expectations should be a little bit higher, and transitions having clear beginnings and endings to the different activities. Some reflective questions I think that you can ask yourself is, number one, what structure and stages could give the most efficiency to the lesson? If you had stages of the lesson that were given a time allotment, what structure and stages would give the lesson the most efficiency. This should be, I think the lesson should be broken down into several stages, and that would help. Another reflective question is, what kind of norms and transitions are you willing to put into place and stick to allow for more students to participate? Here's some recommended strategies I have for you. Number one, of course, the students raising their hands. You need to have some kind of point or reward system for them for raising their hands, and also like a punishment system. In the first week of class, when trying to establish these norms, you don't have to have the reward or punishment system, but as long as you announce it and make sure they know that the next week you will have a reward and punishment system, that's a good way to put it into place. Another for norms is if you can have a kind of game where they can lower their volume game, like a volume game, or maybe you point to a number on the board, 1, 2, or 3, and say that number means low volume, this means medium, this means a little bit louder. And if you point to that and have them answer questions using that, then that would be pretty good. Another one and then for procedures, the recommended strategies would be go over the rules at the beginning of every class. By the end of the month, maybe even if you go over the rules every single class period, the students should have your rules memorized. Number 2, you should, the second part of the procedure, so the beginning is to go over the rules, the second part should review the last class period, what you did in the last class period, which is what you did in the class. So I think you can keep that. And at this point, you can also answer their questions, any questions they had about the homework. Number 3, review the last class period and get questions about homework done. The topic of the day, and tell kids about the goal of the lesson. Number 4, count down from 5 to get them to silence. You can go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then they can be silent. You did something similar to that, so that was good. Another one is a visual aid to signal the stages of the lesson. This would also help you with the stages of your lesson. To have a visual aid placed near the board about where you are at in the lesson. All of this would benefit the quieter students in the class. It'll benefit the class as a whole, but specifically it would benefit the quieter students in the class. So as far as a timeline, the first week, establish the rules. There's no punishment for it. We can communicate by, WeChat or talking on the phone at least once a week. You try to speak in a less conversational way that first week and try to keep doing it as it goes on. Week number 2, you can implement the punishments and reward system and implement a lesson structure that you've worked on. In week 3, we can do an evaluation and see what's working so far, and then also try to reflect on those questions you asked yourself and reflect in general on how it's gone. And then week 4, a final class observation. And so that's pretty much it for you. Now I'm going to turn it over to you, Stephanie, for me.
Okay. So your class is grade 9 to 12. And Zach, you show the efficient use of instructional time as the lesson is well prepared and evidence is shown during my observations. So your lesson started by reviewing the classroom rules from previous lesson, and you and your students designed a set of rules associated with them. So today, student voted a punishment for the rules, and then they sign an agreement contract to their rules. I think this is a good idea for students' involvement in the classroom norms, as it will increase students' ownership of the management for the classroom. And later, you started the introductions to your unit, me today and me tomorrow. You use PowerPoint to present throughout your lesson. You divided the lesson and your activities into 5 parts. The objective of the lesson is clearly posted on the screen and is properly worded. So you establish a learning goal for the unit as a student will improve their speaking and presentation skill by midterms. So in order for learning to be effective, you need to have a clear targets in terms of information and skill must be established. You need to communicate to your students the related activities are helping them to achieve their learning goal. And then it is necessary for you to track your students' progress. I write a rubric on the learning goal at the beginning of the unit so it helps you and your students have a clear directions about instructional targets, students' level of understanding and their performance. You also need to effectively use the formative assessment to track your students' progress. I think this is one of the area of growth that you will need to improve for your practice, and you may refer to my coaching plan that I'll be sending to you after the feedback. So you project a calm voice and always checking students for understanding throughout the lesson. Your guided practice is appropriate, emphasizing clear explanation. Frequently use examples and invite students' participation for answering the questions. And I think you need to work on effective questioning as most of your questions asked by you are on the lower level of Bloom taxonomy. So understand how to create a higher order questions and implement them within your lesson is a concept that you can develop further in your professional development. I think you need a clicker for better presentation skill, and you don't need to go back and forth to click on your computer for the next slide. So this will save you a lot of time. So during the presentation, you need to show more eye contact with your students and keeping everyone accountable. And you seldom call their names, but calling group 1, group 2, and so on. And you seldom use your sense of humor in presenting to promote students' engagement in the learning. So you don't encourage, I don't see you encourage them to have a group discussions and collaboration in a lesson. So your students' engagement. So your students are well managed, willingly compliant and ritually engaged, but students show less enthusiasm and student-to-student interaction about the lesson. So your students are working on their existing knowledge and using the information to create a poster for the presentation next lesson. So improvement on your engaging student in the lesson is another area of growth for your practice. And you can use a lot of activities to encourage students' engagement in your lesson. For example, having your students to set a list of questions about what you want to know about your friend. You can have the activity in the class for your students to interview their friend. I think this is a good way to start the year as getting to know your friend better. And they also can share their hobby, what they're good at, and what you want to be in future and why. So this activity will help your students in the speaking skill when they are asking and answering questions in English. So you can invite a few students to come up stage and share their story about their friends after the interview. And I think you can also integrate technology to this age group because for them to engage learning. So you can have your student to create a video about themselves today and tomorrow, and they can show and introduce themselves in an interesting way. So your classroom environment, I can see materials are available in the classroom on the students' table. But students interact with peers in Korean, and you should encourage them to communicate in English for improving their speaking skill. I think it is a good idea for setting up a rule for not speaking English, Korean in your class as a rule matches your learning goal. And I don't see any student work display on the class, and no routines, procedures, or evidence in the classroom. And you are not firm about the expectation of the rules, as students should be quiet when the teacher asks. When teachers count down from 5 to 0, everyone should be quiet. And you show a low expectation of this rule, and you don't wait for the voice level to 0, and you start your lesson even though they are still students talking to each other. I think it will be good if you set a high expectation at the beginning of the year. And when you count down to 0, the class should be total silent and listen to you. A lot of students didn't raise their hand when they wanted to give an opinion or answer to your questions. I think it should be good to introduce the hand raise rule to your class. From the observation, you don't have the procedures on how to hand in classwork, tables clean up. I think it is a good idea to have them too. So the reflective question I have for you is like, what will I do to establish and communicate learning goals, tracking student progress, and celebrate success? The second question is, what will I do to engage students? And number 3 is, what will I do to establish and maintain effective relationship with your students? And in the week 1, you will read the coaching focus on 2 identified areas of growth and introduce the additional rules and procedures to the student. You need to set a higher expectation for managing counting down transition for gaining student attention and practice with them. And you can have your student create poster about rules and procedure and put them on those classroom wall or bulletin board. So in week 2, you will revise your lesson plan according to the coaching plan and make sure all your students know all the norms, procedures, and transition. And we will meet in week 3 about your revised lesson plan, and you will start implementing your revised plan in week 4. So you need to write a self-evaluation on how these strategies implemented have changed your classroom, and we will discuss about it. And I will schedule another observation in week 5 to discuss about the comparison to your first supervised class versus the class you have in 5 weeks later. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Do you think it's good?